Hello, folks.
Hello.
We're now all online. I'm happy to say. I'm sorry, very sorry for all of those people who've been hanging on. We had a technical hitch there. Thanks for waiting. Thanks for your patience. So we're going to kick off from the top. Just bear with us 1 second, and we'll get going straight forthwith. So I'm going to skip forward. We're going to introduce the attendees, the panelists that we have here with us today. We have Eric Rockwell, who's the CEO of inSOC. We have Dave Watts, who's the CFO of inSOC. And we have Miles Keogh, who is the CEO of Spade Technology. And we have George Mackay, who is the president of Mackay InfoSec. And I'm going to be moderating today. Now, this is the floor for you. So basically, we want your questions. And we've got a couple of questions we're going to kick off with. So the first one, if I could direct this to you, Eric, is what were the first steps you took when you began adding security services to your offering?
Well, when I had an MSP in my previous life, we had companies that were in regulated industries. And in around 2009, 2010, we started working with biotech and life science companies that were heavily regulated. And that was the first time I ever met with a real auditor and had my butt handed to me. And I started getting immersed in the questions that they were asking and trying to figure out how to properly answer them. And that's when I first discovered that there were internationally recognized frameworks for information technology and information security. And everything that I had been doing previously at an MSP was just kind of made up or based on someone's best practices, not based on a known framework, a known right way of doing things. And after I started trying to align with that framework, I realized that we could create a completely separate offering that was based around information security that companies were willing to pay for. And I believe that Miles has an MSP in Boston, and I think that he has taken a similar approach. Is that right, Miles?
Yeah. So we've been around for 17 years, and sort of a traditional MSP only kind of model. And we had a lot of clients that kept hitting issues in regulatory space, such as ITAR, DoD, SEC, HIPAA, and similar kind of thing. We went through a few audits and realized that these small to mid-sized organizations had to conform to regulations that are designed and audited like large organizations. So they had to become a lot more operationally mature, especially around security. So we started rather than having something separate, we started a separate offering that is specific to just that security piece that we either layer on top of existing MSP clients or do that solely just for clients that already have an outsourced IT or internal IT. And we kind of looked at it as in the future, 2, 3, 4 years from now, I think that's going to be part of just our core offering. Having this kind of security, this isn't something just for regulated space. This is something that eventually everybody's going to have. And our thought was, the earlier we can get into it, the better. So we dove in pretty heavily about 2.5 years ago, and haven't looked back since.
By the way, Miles, I think you're spot on. I think that there is a limited amount of time that companies are going to be willing to pay. I don't want to call it a premium, but they're going to be willing to pay for the right amount of security before it becomes a standardized offering and commoditized. But I think we have a while before that happens.
Yep, and I think George took we both have a very similar way that we apply our cybersecurity, but I think he kind of took a different path. I don't know if you want
Yeah, he took, so what he decided to do was separate the information technology and information security services into not only two different offerings, but two different companies. And one of the advantages of that is that it demonstrates segregation of duties, which Miles, you're doing by having a different team, different personnel handling managed services than information security. George kind of took that to a different level and is not only demonstrating segregation of duties by having separate companies, but he's also working with clients on the InfoSec side who are not MSP clients and vice versa. And he's found that they feed each other, and MSP clients are interested in managed security services, and clients that are onboarded with just managed security services in some cases end up becoming MSP clients because because whatever MSP they're working with isn't able to meet some of the requirements from these frameworks that we're talking about.
And thank you for that. Dave, is there anything you'd like to add on that front as well from your experience at NetFusion?
Yeah, with NetFusion, I think we took a little bit of a different approach in that we were maybe not as proactive in the beginning as Eric and Miles were. What we discovered was is that we had an information security firm auditing some of our clients, and they were, as going through these audits, I started to recognize that we were not able to fulfill all the audit requirements with our existing tool set, and that we needed to be able to be adding a lot more additional security, additional logging, and we didn't have the ability to be able to meet these audit requirements. So then we started looking for, tools and things like that, and then as we started to look around, then I started recognizing not only did we not have these tools to meet the audit requirements, but we also, it opened my eyes to the fact that we really didn't have any insight, what was going on inside of the network once you got past the perimeter defenses. So that's how we started adding what we made up a term called unified security management that allowed us to bundle some different tools together, including what we now use from inSOC, and turn that into a additional package we could sell to our clients. And it gives them a lot better protection, and it also allows us to, I felt like if we weren't going to offer that, someone else was going to come in and offer it behind us.
Yeah, just to add to that, Dave, the other huge benefit I think that we'll all agree is it also makes your MSP better, right?
Much better.
Yep.
The more we started to do it, it's like as soon as you get started and you start recognizing, I don't really have any, kind of like an alarm system. I have an alarm on the windows and the doors, but if somebody happens to get past a window or a door, I have no motion sensors inside my network. I have no cameras. I don't know what's going on once they get past, a perimeter defense. Once I recognized that and started working on that, then I started recognizing and also trying to meet these audit requirements. Then I started recognizing there's all these other things I should be doing as part of trying to create a security offering.
Right. I think that's a really good analogy, Dave. And one of the concerns that I've heard a lot of MSPs voice is that, well, if we start getting insight into this stuff, into security threats and alerts, isn't that going to create more noise and tickets? And it's kind of an interesting question because in the beginning, as you're implementing these different tools and implementing this framework, and the framework that we're talking about is called the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, you figure out that things are going on that are probably unauthorized or shouldn't have been happening. And there's a process to go through and harden the environment so that you don't have a lot of noise. You end up turning off a lot of the things that were leading to that noise, leading to security threats that eventually lead to breach. And what you're ending up doing is spending the time to install the sensors, the sensors on all of your doors and windows and the cameras, and think about it as going through that installation process at your house. But once you've done that work and you have all the sensors activated and you know what is and is not authorized, then it ends up decreasing the noise and you're only responding to bad things that shouldn't be happening. And it ends up making your MSP a lot more proactive, because for those of you that have been through breaches, they cost hundreds of hours and tens of thousands of dollars. So in the long run, it actually decreases the amount of noise and the amount of reactive work that you have to do. Have you had that same sort of experience, David Miles?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the reason why I keep saying I can't. I don't know what the date is, but 2-3 years from now, whatever it is, I'm not going to want to work with clients that don't take security seriously, because why would you want to work with, if we have 75-80% of our clients that have a managed security program in place, they're going to be so much quieter, so much better to work with, not only profitable, but we'll be able to have strategic long-term discussions and planning sessions with them, because they're not going to be dealing with all the firefighting of ransomware and the security concerns they have. It's just incredible how much that managed security program makes we can see our MSP clients that are running it, how different their operational metrics are, how much better they are.
We have
Miles, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Dave.
I have a question for Miles, and that it's one we start to talk about. We've all been doing this for a while, and so we start to talk about things that maybe some of the listeners haven't been doing yet or aren't really aware of. Like, we're talking about these NIST frameworks or CIS 20 frameworks, security net frameworks, et cetera, which are all great and are definitely things we want to all get to. But how did you, Miles, how did you just get started with your security practice? What did you do first to go out and what did you put into it, and what did you go out and how did you talk to your clients about it?
I mean, I think the first thing is learning more about the NIST framework, and to us that was, we had different best practices for different industries. So we had HIPAA clients, and they had to be their HIPAA, best practices, and we had people at the DoD, and they had different ones, and SEC, and so we're managing these different, but they're all trying to do the same thing, right? They're trying to secure and protect the data. So when we saw the NIST framework, it all kind of clicked to us, like, this is one framework that we can apply to all these different industries. So for us, the big thing was kind of just reading and learning about it. And it's so funny, all this stuff is just, you can access the data, about the CIS 20 and the NIST framework for free, and just read about it, just so you have a better understanding. That was sort of the first piece. The second piece is to educate our clients. We just did some basic, our people that do the strategy and planning with our clients have brought it up in passing. And what we found is great is just doing a simple SML assessment. And even if people don't move forward with some sort of managed security practice, it opens their eyes. Security maturity level. So it's basically going in and looking and saying, hey, how do you compare? How are you set up, and how are you operating compared to the NIST framework, really, right? How secure is your environment? The nice part about it is it's not my opinion or our company's opinion. It's a internationally recognized expert that we're comparing them to. It's sort of the one standard, right? So for us, it was easy to make that comparison, because it's not they could see it wasn't a biased opinion. But the nice part is, even the ones that don't, even if they don't go with the managed security program right away, it educates them of it's a liability that's kind of taken off of our plate, because we're now telling them, look, here's all your risk and exposure, and by the way, your managed services program doesn't cover this, because they think, well, we're responsible for all security, period, end of discussion, and that's not true. So to really educate them on where the gaps are and what it means to their business. Again, if I'm a business owner, if I'm one of my clients, even if I don't want to pull the trigger on something yet, or I don't feel the values there yet for some reason or another, or I'm not in a regulated space, it's good for me to know where my exposure is. And again, as an MSP, it's great for us to know we've kind of checked that box on the liability. Hey, we informed the client of their risk. So that was really the big.
I think one thing that that's really good, when you said that, talk about it, like it removes the liability for you, which I think is huge. I think it also does something else. It lets them know that you offer these services. So even if they decline, if someone else comes in, a company that only does InfoSec comes in behind you and calls on them, they're going to know if they're interested, they should come back and talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, Dave, that's my fear, is someone comes in off the street and educates my client on something I should have educated them on.
That's the real magic, is being the first ones to educate your clients about it. And this is a really, really good way to establish yourself even further as a trusted expert. I know that's what I've seen from my experience. Dave and Miles and George, you probably have had the same experience. And I think that George is on now. And I know that in his case, he actually had an MSP client that got breached, and they ended up bringing in an InfoSec firm after the breach, and ended up paying that InfoSec company not only a lot of money to recommend the same sort of framework and the same sort of security controls, but that security firm was not, they had no agenda to play nice with George's MSP. And I think that's part of the risk that Dave was talking about. If you're not the ones doing this, if somebody else comes into the hen house, it might risk the relationship that you have with your client.
One of the things I have a feeling that I'm a very practical person, so I'm going to speak for the practical people. How do you package these services for your client? Like, how do you get started as far as like what you approach them with, what specific packages, or are you going out to sell, or are you going out and talking about assessment first, or can it be done both ways?
Miles, you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we found that it can be done both ways, and it kind of depends on where they are. We have some clients that they don't have a choice. They're working with the DoD, or 25+% of their revenue comes from the DoD. They really don't have a choice. So we go out and we've done we kind of say, hey, we're gonna put this managed offering together for you, and I can kind of tell you how we did ours. But we start with an SML assessment no matter what, and then kind of work our way through. There are some that, and I'll tell you from an MSP perspective, I'm not a big fan of the go in and do a network assessment as part of the sales process. But I do think on the security side, the SML assessment is, because there's a lot more education that has to go into it, I do think it's a worthwhile process. We actually had a client that 10% of their revenue came from the DoD, and they got a DFARS notice, which is basically a notice from the Department of Defense saying, you have to comply with the NIST framework, right? So in order to work with us, we're going to pull your contract. So we went in and did the SML assessment. We showed them the plan and what they would have to do in their business in order to keep the DoD agreement. And they actually looked at it and said, that's a smaller portion of our revenue. It's not that profitable. We're actually not going to do DoD work anymore, which I know doesn't sound like maybe right off the bat like a success story, but to us it was, because if you want to talk about getting involved and building a good trusting relationship with a client, we helped them make a pretty strategic decision on their business that they couldn't have made on their own. So I do think that SML is important up front. After that, we looked at, we have ours basically broken down based on the level they want to achieve on that, on their SML assessment. So that basically the SML assessments will break out into different kind of scoring, and that scoring often ties to what the different regulatory bodies want. So the DoD wants a certain level, HIPAA, you have to have a certain level. So we built our practice so there's sort of like for lack of a better term, small, medium, large, but they're not just small, medium, large by our standards. They're by sort of where they need to be from a security perspective, so that they can match it up with their business requirement.
Very cool. Now, Miles, just out of curiosity, I think you have another DFARS regulated client that has more than 10% of their revenue coming from defense work, and I think they not only moved forward, but they actually get audited by the NCIS. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was really cool and terrifying at the same time. That was the first time we've dealt with NCIS. 100% of their revenue comes from the Navy, and they don't joke around. So we went through the process with them, and there were a couple things that's kind of funny that they pushed back on with us, and we had to kind of go convince them why it was the right thing to do, and they passed with flying colors. And they're not a huge organization headcount wise, but they do a lot of revenue with the DoD and do some very they do a lot of high security kind of work. So that was a great feeling for us to know that, hey, all this work we do, I can't think of a higher regulatory body to have pass our work than NCIS. So that was a great feeling at the end.
Oh, that's awesome. So you guys were able to make the NCIS happy with your information security program.
Yes, absolutely.
Very cool. Christian, do we have any questions that are coming in from attendees that we can ask the panel?
Yes, we do. I was just about to say, we've talked a lot about the framework and approach. Evaluated the tools and services when you were first to make up your security stack, and also whether that evolved along the way, and the tools that perhaps you set out with didn't work out, and how that evolved and what you eventually ended up using. Perhaps I could direct that question first to Miles.
Sorry, Chris, you broke up a little bit on the beginning of that question. What was that again?
Oh, I'm sorry. So I was just saying, we talked a little bit about the framework and how you've approached making up and delivering those services. I was just wondering, one of the questions that's come in is, how did you evaluate the tools and services that you initially chose, and did that change over time? So, for example, did the first services and tools that you chose for your stack, if that didn't work out, how did you move on to the next set, and what drove that decision?
Yeah, I mean, selection of tools in our world obviously is a little nerve-wracking, and especially in this space, because I feel like there's so many newcomers out there. We made some bad decisions right off the bat with some of the tools we selected. We went with some big names that were, the hot and kind of going tool sets. Figuring we can't go wrong with them. And then, but they're a lot of the tools in the cybersecurity space are only a couple of years old. So as we went down the path, a lot of them was they were implementing technology. They weren't implementing a solution. So as we were deploying, we had a SIEM tool we deployed, that same kind of thing. We had a vulnerability tool that we deployed. And a lot of them were based on the technical requirements and the technical end result. And what we realized is we needed something that was policy driven, and we needed to be able to go in and help our clients with the policies. I kind of equate it to a lot of people deploy these tools before they really have the audit and policy discussion. And it's kind of the equivalent of building a house and about halfway through hiring an architect. You really got to kind of start with the architect first and decide what do you want it to look like, and then build the tools to support those policies. And that was probably our biggest mistake. We got sold by some tools people who were touting their brand. So once we realized that, we really kind of looked and said, okay, what's going to help us achieve these goals? We have the policies defined. Now what tools are going to help us achieve these goals? Again, we made some mistakes, but that's where we ended up circling back and cutting everything over to inSOC. We just felt that the inSOC has that same type of policy-driven security, not technology-driven security, which is really what we were looking for.
Christian, this is Dave. Can I add something to that?
Sure, absolutely. I was just going to direct the question at you, Dave, so please do.
Okay. So I had a similar experience as to what Miles described. I'll add to that in that we also bought a big name brand SIEM tool for doing all the monitoring and detecting, etc. And then we had to go out and find a separate company to help us with the SOC. We originally tried to do the Security Operations Center portion ourselves, and then realized that we weren't staffed properly to be able to do that SOC, a Security Operations Center. We weren't properly staffed to do that, either from a 24/7 perspective, but also from we didn't have the experience or the knowledge to be able to determine what some of these alerts, if they were actually something that were critical and needed attention or not. So we ended up hiring a separate company, the SOC company, to work with the tool set that we had already bought. Remember, so I'm already dealing with 2 different companies. Then I wanted to, because I was trying to follow the information security policies correctly, I bought a third tool or a third investment in a vulnerability management system that I could only run at certain times. It didn't give me any history of what I had done on my how I remediated them. So I had 3 different things trying to work separately, try to band-aid them all together, get the SOC to be able to interface with the SIEM tool. They didn't interface at all with the vulnerability management. And finally, I recognized that we were not doing a good job. We were not achieving the policies that we were trying to, standardize our clients on. So that's when we started working with inSOC. inSOC's nice because it combines all 3 of those things into one holistic solution, which I found really helpful, and it reduced my staff's time and allows us to be able to go out and educate the clients, but not have to worry about all the technical portions ourselves.
Very cool. Christian, I think we might
Eric,
have...
Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think we might have George on the line, so I'd love to hear his comments on it before I say anything. Are you there, George?
I think George might be having a couple of sound issues. I might need to direct that question to you, Eric, first, while we see if we can get him online.
Sure. Well, I had the same experience that Dave and George had in my last MSP. That was a big reason why we founded inSOC. That was a strong part of the vision, was to be able to bring this policy-driven framework down to a level that MSPs could actually offer and deliver on, and completely remove the layers of complexity from the MSP, so that it's something that you can offer and deliver without having to become experts on regulations or frameworks. That's something that you can learn over time, but not have to actually enter with. And I can tell you just a little bit about security policies from the work that we do with other clients, that security policies don't have to be just legalese. They can be very practical, and they're based around what sort of things does the business actually need to conduct business, what should be allowed, and we should probably monitor for everything else that is simply not allowed. And an example of that would be saying that our authorized access of remote, or our authorized remote access technology is, let's say it's a VPN. Well, we should probably know if somebody opens up a remote desktop port or installs TeamViewer on a computer, or if a former MSP's RMM agent is still on one of the computers, we should know if there are any unauthorized remote access sessions. And with previous tools that I've worked with in the past, I've worked with a lot of different SIEM and vulnerability management systems. SIEM stands for Security Information Event Management System. It's a very mature technology in the marketplace. Unfortunately, most of those SIEMs, like the ones that I've worked with in the past, they take not days, not weeks, but months to actually install and tune. And I talked to a company a couple of weeks ago who has been trying to install a SIEM tool for the last 2 years, and it's still not done. So that's a big part of the challenge, and part of our strategy was to take all the tuning, all the NIST security controls, the top 20 critical security controls from NIST, and pre-tune them and build them into the product so that the MSPs don't have to worry about doing all that work. They get a box that's pre-configured that they have to plug into the network, and the actual installation, including connecting to security events in cloud resources like Microsoft 365 and Amazon, should be under an hour. And that's a part of our vision in making security simple and profitable for MSPs.
And
speaking of profit, Eric. Speaking of profit, go ahead, Miles. But I want to make sure we touch on profit in a minute. But you go first, Miles.
Yeah. So just to add to that, if for those that have been in this space long enough and they remember IDS and IPS, right? Intrusion detection services versus intrusion prevention services. The intrusion detection services, when it first came out, was we're going to find all these things and we're going to flood you with all this information. And we had a client that it was a 220-person law firm, and they had to staff someone full time just to get all the data that was coming to them. And the reason why is they didn't go through that process of dialing it in before they turned it on to say, this is what we need to know. And that's what we dealt with the other SIEM tools, is it was just giving us all this junk. And we had to try to figure out what was good and what wasn't, and we had no way we weren't qualified to know what was something we needed to act on and what we should ignore. And that's what when we finally moved over to inSOC, and we had both our SOC team and our SIEM tool together, where they were based on that NIST framework. We knew exactly what we needed. We could filter out the other junk and know that the stuff that we're getting through our SOC is stuff we actually have to take action on. It's not just noise. So it allows us to really kind of, first of all, it makes us look a lot more intelligent to our clients, because when we go through reports, it's not a bunch of junk they have to skip over. And that's what, for us, I get why other MSPs are nervous about the amount of tickets that will be created with the solution, a security solution, or security practice rather. But that's what kind of eliminates that, is, again, making sure you have the architect in there first, meaning the policies, and then design the technology around that.
Well, otherwise, you're flooded with data, and what you want is information, not data. You don't want a raw, a fire hose of data, of alerts. You want to get true information about the things you need to know about. Two things I wanted to make sure that we covered. One, I was going to ask Eric, can you briefly explain a little bit about the CIS-20, because I think we keep talking about the NIST framework, and I know the NIST framework is very large, and I think that for people wanting to get started, it might seem a little bit more manageable or bite-sized or easier if they understood the CIS-20 and how that really applies to inSOC.
Yeah, definitely. So the NIST cybersecurity framework is very large. There's 572 security controls in it. The security controls that are included in the DFARS regulation, there's 140 of those. And the CIS-20, the CIS is the Center for Internet Security. I'm actually a member of the Center for Internet Security. We work very closely with them. We do webinars and white papers with them. We share a lot of our data with them. And what the Center for Internet Security has done is they've taken all these billions of breach reports, billions of records that have been breached in the US that have been reported to the US Computer Emergency Response Team, and they've analyzed them and come up with the top 20 NIST security controls that are called critical security controls that would have prevented most of those breaches, up to 98% of those breaches. And the top 6 controls would have prevented 85% of those breaches. And part of our strategy with inSOC is to lead with all the different things that tools can do for most of those controls across the CIS-20, and be able to specifically focus on the top 6, so that instead of just looking at all the noise like Miles was talking about, we're looking at the most meaningful events that led to most of the breaches in this country over the past couple of years. And every year, the Center for Internet Security reanalyzes the top 20 controls and reprioritizes them and republishes them based on recent breaches. So this is something that we're very closely aligned with. We found that it's a very practical first step for MSPs to implement a framework like NIST.
That's great. So it greatly simplifies it. You're bringing basically 572 controls down to the top 20 that would have prevented the most breaches.
Exactly. And some of these controls are not necessarily intuitive, but after you think about them and understand them, they make sense and they're extremely logical. And I'll give you an example. Most of the breaches in this country going back 7 years didn't happen because an elite cyber criminal hacked through a firewall, or somebody clicked on a phishing email or something like that. Those are all included in the top 20. But the most common cause of a breach is actually someone bringing a personally owned asset into the office, and that personally owned asset has malware on it, and they don't know it has malware on it. And they connect to the wireless network. They've got the password to the private wireless network, or there's no guest network. And once they get online, that malware starts running IT tools, technology tools that scan the network, that find information about the network, that find open ports on the servers, that maybe see passwords in clear text, and they send that information back to a cyber criminal who has an RMM type console who's just managing millions of pieces of malware on these computers. And they basically have access to millions of computers inside real businesses, and they're able to launch attacks that give them more permanent levels of access from behind the firewall. So believe it or not, that's the top security control and from NIST, and that's the top thing that we're looking at inSOC in helping MSPs and our clients prevent these types of breaches. And we do that simply by the policy first approach. Which assets are owned by the company? Which are allowed to be inside of the private network? Do they all have proper anti-malware and URL filtering on them? Well, let's go ahead and authorize these 50 or 100 computers, and now let's get alerted if any unauthorized assets join the network.
That's a great one. I know there's some other ones that NetFusion was never able to do until we implemented a solution like inSOC, and that was things like as simple as, did we even know if someone was opening up ports on the firewall? That includes my staff opening up ports on a client's firewall. Do we know about that? Do we know if someone is elevating someone's privileges to administrator? Okay. There's all sorts of things. What are a few other ones, Eric, that inSOC addresses that are in those CIS top 20?
You are spot on, Dave. It's all about defining what's authorized and then getting alerted on what's unauthorized. So one of the controls that hits home with a lot of MSPs pertains to phishing attacks. And the simple question is, if a cyber criminal were to phish one of your client's passwords and they actually logged into something like Office 365, would you know? And the most common answer that we receive is no, we wouldn't know. And typically the MSPs don't know until they've orchestrated a breach or a money wiring scheme or something like that. And that's one of the top 20 critical security controls. It's actually part of number 16. And what we're able to do is correlate geographical locations with logins and see that, Dave, let's say that you're logged in from a computer in Los Angeles, or your smartphone is syncing from a computer in Los Angeles, and then another user logs in as you from a computer in Russia 5 minutes later. Well, that's an impossible travel distance, and that's something that generates an alert, and that's a very high priority alert that isn't probably just noise. That's a strong indication of a breach.
One of the things I wanted to cover, because I have again, I'm super practical. I think that people are probably curious, is how do they make money on this? And I was going to address, I'll tell you how NetFusion does it, but I'm curious about how Miles and Eric, actually, I'll just ask Miles first. How do you make money on selling the security? Like, what is your NRR? What is your MRR portions of this?
Yeah, that's a good point, the NRR piece. So our MRR portion of it is, again, we have sort of a couple different tiers delivered the same way. It's just some people get additional services based on their requirements. What's nice about it is the core technology we use behind it with inSOC and all three sort of layers is delivered the same way. So I'm a big believer of standardization. The other two delivery areas that are the MRR, we're doing it based on the additional kind of CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, things that they get, whether they're quarterly meetings or monthly meetings and reviews, depending on what their requirements are. Some regulatory bodies require that monthly we're having these meetings and reviews and that kind of thing. The NRR portion to it, there's things that our MSP has asked our clients to do for years, and they know they should do it, but they just keep deprioritizing it. Once it become part of our MSP, our MSSP, our managed security practice, it becomes a no-brainer because they see why we're doing it. They see it's tied to something that they need either for their space, or it's tied to something that's a known, like, it's not our opinion again, it's the NIST framework, the top 20 security controls, this is what you actually have to have, and it becomes a no-brainer for them. They also see how low their SML scores are, and they know that as we work with them, we go through and say, hey, let's see how we can get your score up as fast as possible, meaning the higher your score, the more secure you are. So we look at what things they can implement and what should they prioritize to get their score up as high as possible. And that can be everything from deploying, hard drive encryption, multi-factor authentication tools, password managers, 8021X for their DHCP and their wireless, so that so only company assets can join the network. And then stuff as simple as, a lot of our tools already as an MSP allow us to do hardware and software auditing, but our clients don't care about the hardware and software auditing. So now we can sit down with them and say, hey, look, at part of this is we're going to look at what you have as assets on your network and explain to them why they care. And now when the engineer comes to the VP of engineering and says, hey, I need this one-off app, I'm going to download it and install it, which oftentimes becomes some sort of break-fix problem for our MSP, the policy is, yeah, that's not going to happen. We need to go through an approval policy, make sure this is okay, et cetera. And it just helps them run more operationally mature. So I always say it's interesting in this model, the more NRR they spend with, the more project work they spend with us, it's the more they're saying they're buying into the model and buying into our belief. And also the more profitable client they come for us because they have less noise.
Right. I know one thing with NetFusion on the MRR side, so I personally was concerned, would clients be willing to pay additional amount on top of what we already charge them as an MSP for these additional security services on a monthly basis? And I was very pleasantly surprised to learn that for whatever we put into it, we could sell it at either like 1.5 to 2 times what our costs were. So we were making anywhere between 33 to 50% or margin on whatever we were investing. And again, the more you align them with all this stuff, the less noisy they become in general. So you also have like that hidden profit on the MSP side from them being less noisy, but you also have the pure profit on the MRR from reselling the tool sets and providing the things that they need to do to be able to align themselves with these security controls.
Not to mention the retention, right? I mean,
Yeah,
when you're having that level of discussion with them, it's very hard for someone to call in off the street and say, hey, we're $5 less per user, will you switch? They know we're pretty heavily entrenched in not just their technology, but their entire operation, their policies, their procedures, how they function, et cetera.
Exactly. And I know we've talked about this, George and Miles, but it's pretty cool when you walk into a deal with a prospect and they say, oh, well, these guys are only $100 a month or whatever, and you can say, wow, that's crazy. I don't know how they could do that. Are you sure they're actually aligning this with a commonly recognized framework, or are they just kind of making this up and doing it their way? And being able to demonstrate compliance with something that's standardized like this has helped a lot of our clients win deals at a much higher price per user and immediately disqualify the competitors. And I know that George had a similar experience a couple months ago where he won an MSP deal with and an MSSP deal with a hospital. I wish George was on to talk about that, but what I can say is not only was the old MSP disqualified and fired, but the other competitors were disqualified, and they ended up spending almost 4 times the amount per month that they were spending before, and they were very happy to do it once they learned what they were getting and they realized that they were throwing their money away with everyone else. Also, I can see that a lot of people are messaging us about that security maturity assessment. I know that we're probably running out of time here, so maybe what we can do, guys, is follow up with all of the attendees and schedule another Ask Me Anything if you guys, Miles and George, would be willing to come back on, and we could maybe talk a little bit more about that security maturity assessment and the CIS 20, and talk about how much you're charging for those or how to sell or conduct them. So Miles and George, we'll follow up with you guys and see if that's something that you'd be willing to do.
Yeah,
sure,
absolutely. And a little.
Sorry, Miles.
I was gonna say, and a little teaser on that, Eric. That is something that I think we've done a nice job of coming up with something that is both profitable for us and small enough bite size for clients to buy into. And I'll just say it this way: initially, we were doing them for 7 times more than we're doing them today. And as soon as we're able to find a way to do it, that lower cost point, and do it profitably and get good results out of it, it's opened a ton more doors. So that's definitely key to this process.
That's awesome. And I know with you and George, you're able to sell those to various sizes of companies, very small 10 or 20 user companies and very large multi-100 user companies. So it's pretty cool for MSPs that are trying to go up market, but it scales down all the way down to small companies too.
Yeah, and we can also sell it to companies that are using our competitors as an MSP, which is nice.
Oh man, I bet that's the best.
Yep.
Yeah, as you said, Eric, we have got a few more questions around that, but we're running out of time. So if we could perhaps just wrap up.
Yeah, definitely.
Final thought from each of you as to your top tip for anyone looking to get started. We'll let you go
Sure,
first,
I'll
Eric.
I'll go. Oh, go ahead, Eric. You can go first.
Okay.
Well, what I was going to say is there's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of tools out there. I think everybody that's on the panel agrees that aligning with a commonly recognized framework is the winning approach. That's going to long outlive all the tools that pop up and disappear. And that's been here for decades. It'll continue to be here for decades. We believe that's the winning approach. And starting with the CIS 20 has been the winning approach for the companies that we're working with. And I'm not saying that because I'm a member of the Center for Internet Security. I'm saying that because we've actually seen a lot of success with it. And that's specifically why we built the inSOC offering around the CIS 20. And I recommend looking at that before you add any tools to a security offering. Try to understand that and align with that before you start selling security services to your clients.
I'll add something in the top tip. I'm going to agree with Eric on that. You want to, and I loved Miles's analogy about the house. Like, you don't build a house and halfway through say, maybe we should have talked to an architect. So I like that. The architect portion is, picking a standard set of controls, based on NIST. I like the CIS-20 myself because it makes it manageable. Your client sees it as manageable. They see it as achievable. It's going to meet, 98% of all your requirements out there. And it's also, if you implement all 20, it's actually going to prevent 6 or 7% of all known breaches that happened last year. And then it's also something that changes, and so you're going to be able to adapt with it, and that's going to continue to give you MRR for working with your clients. So anyway, choose your set of controls. I would recommend the CIS-20, and then choose your tools based on which will accomplish the most of those. But figure out how to do your maturity assessment first with a client, because that's going to get them to open their eyes as far as where they are and where they should be.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, before either of you spoke, that was what I was going to mention, is going to the, go look up the CIS-20, educate yourself before you look at any tools. And as you go through, don't get caught up in the technology portion of it. The technology should be there to enforce the policies, not vice versa. Don't go technology first. But educate yourself on that and start thinking of ways that you can start educating your clients. The CIS-20 can very easily, with light translation, be put in CEO language, and it's something that you can start educating your clients about even before you have a managed security practice. To start educating your clients about, hey, here are some of the reasons, here's some of the top 20 security controls, especially the top 5, focus on them, and this is why they're important. Get it out by your email blasts or whatever you do to your clients and prospects, and start to establish yourself as an expert in that space, or at least knowledgeable in that space, because someone's gonna ring your client, and they're gonna be the ones to educate them, not you, and that's not gonna end well for you. So even before you have the practice, if you can start educating them, they'll at least know they heard it from you first.
Thank you very much, Miles. Unfortunately, George is still lost in webinar space somewhere for the sound side of it. But we're hoping to we'll get him back on the next session that we have, so I'm sure we can hear from him then. So I'm going to wrap it up there. The recording will be available afterwards, and I'll make sure that's mailed out to everyone. Just a last thank you to our panelists for their time. Very interesting stuff, and I hope it's been of interest to everybody. Thanks, everyone, and we'll hope to see you next time.
Take care, everyone.
Hey, thanks, Miles. Cheers.